Volume 2, Chapter 3 Topics. The Electoral Count of 1877. Senator Morton's Scheme. Tilden's History of the Presidential Counts. President Grant concedes Tilden's election. Electoral Commission created. Disapproved by Tilden. Refuses to raffle for the presidency. Horatio Seymour's speech before the New York electors. Dr. Franklin's advice to his son. The Florida case. The Louisiana case. The Oregon case. Conflicting decisions of the Commission. The Commission for sale. The forged certificates from Louisiana. Decision of the Commission condemned by the House of Representatives. Letter of Charles Francis Adams. The Fraud Blazon. Tilden's reply. Protest of the Democratic minority of the Electoral Commission. Thurman and Bayard. James Russell Lowell. At the meeting of Congress in December, the absorbing question was the counting of the electoral vote. It had been usual for Congress to define in advance the manner in which this duty should be discharged. In the session of 1864-5, Congress provided that no electoral vote objected to by either House of Congress should be counted except by the concurrent votes of both houses. This became notorious as the 22nd Rule. It was readopted at the three successive electoral counts of 1865, 1869, and 1873. This rule, after having been in force for three successive elections, was abandoned by a resolution of the Senate in December 1875, on motion of Senator Edmunds, at whose instance the Senate adopted the rules of that body and the joint rules of the two houses except the 22nd joint rule heretofore in use. The House of Representatives was at this time largely Democratic, and, had the 22nd joint rule continued in force, any electoral votes which it refused to count would have been rejected. The rule, which was doubtful constitutionality, had been originally adopted, and subsequently renewed, for partisan ends. For partisan ends it was now dispensed with by the Senate, thus leaving the two houses without any rule to govern them for counting the electoral votes in February, 1877. Prior to 1865 and before the adoption of the 22nd joint rule above referred to, it had been the practice of two houses of Congress, a little in advance of the day fixed by the Act of 1792 for counting the votes, the second Wednesday of February, to agree upon the place of meeting for the discharge of this duty and the order of procedure. Various efforts had been made from time to time, by one house or the other, previous to the adoption of the 22nd rule, to appropriate it to itself the power to determine the validity of electoral votes, but all had, for one reason or another, proved abortive. The 22nd joint rule, adopted by the Republicans in 1865, assumed for the first time the right to reject electoral votes, as the prerogative of either house. When the certificates of the electors of the several states came to be opened at Washington in 1877, it appeared that the certificates of 34 states were uncontested, but that the remaining 4 were to be contested. These were the certificates from the states of South Carolina, Florida, Louisiana, and Oregon. The electoral vote of the uncontested states was so distributed that the fate of the presidential candidates depended upon the electoral vote of the 4 contested states. Congress having failed to make any provision beforehand, the mode of procedure in counting the electoral vote was the first question to be dealt with. The Republicans had the control of the Senate, the Democrats of the House. The Constitution provided that the President of the Senate shall, in the presence of the Senate and House of Representatives, open all the certificates, and the votes shall then be counted. Senator Morton took the ground that the President of the Senate should be invested with the plenary authority to determine all disputes relative to certificates of the electoral votes, to count them and to declare the result, which declaration was to be accepted as final, conclusive and irrevocable. The President of the Senate at that time, Thomas W. Ferry, of Michigan, owed that position to his party subserviency rather than to his fame as a statesman. The adoption of such a rule would have been equivalent to pronouncing Hayes president and making the counting of the electoral vote an idle ceremony. To make it such was obviously the motive of those who advocated it. The Constitution assigned to the President of the Senate no other specific duty but to open the certificates. Beyond that, he was but one of 3 coordinate bodies authorized to count the votes, settle controversies, and declare the result, as had been virtually the unbroken practice from the foundation of the government. A year had not elapsed since the same Senator Norton had introduced an electoral count bill which required that the affirmative action of both houses of Congress should be required to reject any certificate of electoral votes, and if more than one return was made, only that one should be counted, which the 2 houses, acting separately, shall decide to be the true and valid return. Nothing had occurred to the Constitution which in the spring of 1876 required the concurrence of the 2 houses, acting separately, to count an electoral vote, the President of the Senate to the contrary notwithstanding, that in the winter of the same year could transfer this power to the President of the Senate. That is nothing but a presidential election which begot the temptation to strike the House of Representatives with impotence for the purpose of ensuring the success of the Republican candidates, the inconsistency of the positions, and the absurdity of attempting to reconcile the Constitution with 2 modes of procedure so diametrically opposed to each other, did not prevent Morton's scheme finding favor with his partisans in Congress, who seemed to have reached the conviction that the end of defeating Tilden would sanctify any means necessary to accomplish it, and that the Constitution itself should yield to such an exigency. Such threatening proportions did this scheme assume that Mr. Tilden devoted more than a month to the preparation of a complete history of the electoral counts from the foundation of the government to show it to have been the unbroken usage of Congress, not of the President of the Senate, to count the electoral votes. With influence, if any, this publication had upon the ultimate abandonment of Senator Morton's scheme it is difficult to say. Probably not much, for it taught the senators nothing of which they were ignorant, but about this time the leaders of that body became aware that President Grant did not believe that Hayes was elected, and several prominent Republican members of Congress, among them Senator Conkling, of New York, were under the same impression, and could not be relied upon to assist in upsetting one of the most venerable traditions of the government, nor in becoming accomplices in the fraud to which it was intended to be contributory. President Grant seems at no time to have any doubt about the electoral vote of Louisiana belonging to Tilden and Hendricks, or if its being so ultimately decided. In some reminiscences of the late George W. Childs, published first in the Philadelphia Ledger in 1885, and subsequently in a Vol, that gentleman said, just before General Grant started on his journey around the world, he was spending some days with me, and at dinner with Mr. A. J. Drexel, Colonel A. K. McClure, and myself. General Grant reviewed the contest for the creation of the Electoral Commission, and the contest before and in the Commission, very fully and with rare candor, and the chief significance of his view was in the fact, as he stated it, that he expected from the beginning, until the final judgment, that the electoral vote of Louisiana would be awarded to Tilden. He spoke of South Carolina and Oregon as justly belonging to Hayes, of Florida, as reasonably doubtful, and of Louisiana, as for Tilden. Colonel A. K. McClure and the late A. J. Drexel, who were also guests of Mr. Childs on this occasion, have confirmed his report of this conversation. The plan, therefore, of gagging the House of Representatives in the Electoral College received no encouragement from President Grant. Whether he would have ever made any serious opposition to such a consummation, or whether the Senate would have deferred to him if he had, it is now idle to speculate. Another more plausible, if no less unconstitutional, means of accomplishing the same result was devised for them, the authorship of which has been ascribed to President Grant. On the 14th of December 1876, the House of Representatives appointed a committee of 7 of its members to act in conjunction with any similar committee of the Senate, to prepare and report without delay a measure for the removal of differences of opinion as to the proper mode of counting the electoral votes for President and Vice President of the United States, and of determining questions which might arise as to the legality and validity of the returns of such votes made by the several states, to the end that the votes should be counted and the result declared by a tribunal whose authority none can question and whose decision all will accept. 4 days later, and on the 18th of the same month, the Senate created a special committee of 7 senators with power to prepare and report without unnecessary delay such a measure either of a legislative or other character as may in their judgment be best calculated to accomplish the lawful counting of the electoral votes and best dispose sit ion of all questions connected therewith, and the true declaration of the result, and also, to confer and act with the Committee of the House of Representatives. This joint committee consisted of Senators George F. Edmunds, of Vermont, Frederick T. Frelinghuysen, of New Jersey, Roscoe Conkling, of New York, Alan G. Thurman, of Ohio, Thomas F. Bayard, of Delaware, Matthew W. Ransom, of North Carolina, and Oliver P. Morton, of Indiana, and Representatives Henry B. Payne, of Ohio, Eppa Hunton, of Virginia, Abram S. Hewitt, of New York, William M. Springer, of Illinois, George W. McCrary, of Iowa, George F. Hoare, of Massachusetts, and George Willard, of Michigan. On the 18th of January this committee almost unanimously, Senator Morton only dissenting, reported a bill providing for the creation of a tribunal to be composed of 5 senators, 5 representatives, and 5 associate justices of the Supreme Court of the United States, 4 of the latter being designated by their districts in the bill itself, the 5th to be subsequently chosen by these 4, to which tribunal should be referred the conflicting certificates and accompanying documents from the contested states, and all questions relating to the powers of Congress in the premises, with the authority to exercise the same powers in ascertaining the legal vote of such states. The bill further provided that the decisions of such tribunal in every case should stand, unless rejected by the concurrent vote of both houses. Also those objections which might be made to any votes from states not presenting double certificates should be considered, not by the Commission, but by the houses separately, and unless sustained by both, should be of no effect. The bill, after sharply contested debate in both houses, passed the Senate January 25, and the House of Representatives January 26. In the former the vote was 47 yeas to 17 nays, the Republicans voting 24 yeas to 16 nays, and the Democrats, 23 yeas to 1 nay, absent or not voting, 9 Republicans and 1 Democrat. In the House there were 191 yeas to 86 nays, the Democrats voting 158 yeas to 18 nays, and the Republicans 33 yeas to 68 nays, absent or not voting, 7 Republicans and 7 Democrats. How so large a number of the Democrats in Congress were induced to supersede the constitutional machinery for counting the electoral votes, for a device not only unknown to the Constitution, but in all its important bearings inconsistent with it, can only be explained as we explain most blunders which are woven into the web of every human life. Some yielded through ignorance, some for the want of reflection, some to quiet a controversy about the result of which they were indifferent or apprehensive, some to serve personal ends at home that seemed more important to them than the presidential issue, while upon others, many, if not all, these considerations may have been not without their influence. Unfortunately for Mr. Tilden, the Senate swarmed with Democratic aspirants for the presidency. The 2 on the committee who negotiated the surrender having been strenuous competitors for that honor before the convention which nominated Mr. Tilden. Nor was the House of Representatives lacking in Democratic candidates who had not been able to regard with satisfaction the triumph of a candidate who had not been in the least indebted to Congress for his nomination, nor much for his success at the polls. Then again, there were perhaps no inconsiderable number who indulged the expectation that the proposed tribunal would elect their candidate, which was to them of more concern than the means by which it was accomplished. The latter class was recruited largely from among those who supported Senator Davis, of Illinois, who then occupied a seat on the bench of the Supreme Court, would be selected as the 5th member from that bench, and whose character and moral authority with his colleagues enough was known to quench any suspicion of his lending support to the fraudulent and unconstitutional devices upon which he would have had to sit in judgment. Those who were seduced by this aleatory device were rewarded as they deserved. Just as the Electoral Commission bill became a law, the Independent Republicans and the Democrats in the Illinois legislature elected Judge Davis to the United States Senate. This afforded that gentleman an excuse, of which he naturally availed himself with a prompt alacrity, to decline the proffered place on the commission, and gave to the 4 judges, 2 selected from each party, the choice of the 5th, which resulted in the selection of Justice Bradley, a New Jersey Republican, and in leaving the rival candidates entirely at the mercy of the Republican Party. By whatever motive they were governed, by whatever temptation seduced, it is now but too evident that the representatives of the people in the lower house inexcusably abandoned their coign of vantage and shirked the most solemn and momentous of all their official responsibilities, in a few short weeks to be marched through the Caudine Forks and take their seats of humiliation before the inexorable tribunal of history. It is hardly necessary to say that Mr. Tilden was too large and experienced a statesman to approve of discharging any constitutional duty by any but constitutional methods. As soon as the action of the returning boards furnished a suitable provocation for his interference, he urged his friends in leadership of the House to expose and combat in full debate the threatened, unwarranted usurpation by the President of the Senate of the right to count the votes, and to take no further step until in both houses the great but pacific constitutional battle had been fought on that issue. He was ready to accept all responsibility for the outcome. He assured them that if properly resisted the conspiracy must break down, that it must not be encouraged by the least symptom of concession, but fought inch by inch on the floors of Congress, until the real character of the proposed usurpation should become known throughout the country and the nation's opinion of it could reach Washington. Early in the session he prepared 2 resolutions which raised the issue upon which he wished that battle to be fought, and which, with some slight modifications by the House Committee on the Privileges, Powers, and Duties of the House of Representatives in counting the electoral votes that received his approval, were adopted by that committee and reported to the House. Had the course there traced been followed, it is now apparent that the confirmation of Mr. Tilden's election would have been assured beyond a peradventure. The controlling voices of both parties in the Senate had over and over again, and within a few months, asserted and insisted upon the right of the 2 houses to count the vote. They all knew, and many had repeatedly assisted in adding to, the imposing line of precedence under which a challenge of any electoral certificate by either house had sufficed to exclude its vote from the count. A challenge of a single one of the 19 contested votes would have resulted in Tilden's election either by the concurring vote of the 2 houses, or, they failing to concur, in his election by the House of Representatives, to which the Constitution has confided the choice in such an emergency, and where the Democrats were in the majority, whether voting by themselves or by states. Footnote: It was supposed by many that Morton and others engineered the selection of Davis with a full knowledge that he would not serve. It is difficult to see why Davis did not serve on the commission in spite of his election to the Senate, unless his absence from the commission was one of the conditions of his election. However this may be, his retreat from the field in the presence of the enemy effectually disposed of whatever expectations of preferment he might have entertained from the Democratic Party. This committee consisted of Sparks and Burchard, of Illinois, Tucker, of Virginia, Marsh, of Pennsylvania, Seeley, of Massachusetts, Monroe and Lawrence, of Ohio, and D.D. Field, of New York. The resolutions were as follows: Resolved, first, that the Constitution does not confer upon the President of the Senate the power to examine and ascertain the votes to be counted as the electoral votes for President and Vice President of the United States. Second, that the only power which the Constitution of the United States confers upon the President of the Senate in respect to the electoral votes for President and Vice President of the United States is to receive the sealed lists transmitted to him by the several electoral colleges, to keep the same safely, and to open all the certificates, or those purporting to be such, in the presence of the Senate and House of Representatives. Third, that the Constitution of the United States does confer upon the Senate and the House of Representatives the power to examine and ascertain the votes to be counted as the electoral votes. Fourth, that in execution of their power in respect to the counting of the electoral votes, the House of Representatives is at least equal with the Senate. Fifth, that in the counting of the electoral votes, not vote can be counted against the judgment and determination of the House of Representatives. Sixth, that the committee have leave to sit again and report hereafter further matter for the consideration of the House. The Constitution of the United States, Article 11, Section 111, provides, "The person having the greatest number of votes shall be the President, if such number be the majority of the whole number of electors appointed, and if there be more than one who have such majority, and have an equal number of votes, then the House of Representatives shall immediately choose, by ballot, one of them for president. And if no person have a majority, then from the highest on the list the said House shall in like manner choose the president. End footnote. Happily we do not depend upon rumor nor oral tradition for our knowledge of Mr. Tilden's views of this crisis and the proper mode of dealing with it. They will be found most carefully and fully stated as early as the 1st of January 1877, in the inaugural message of Governor Robinson, of which the portion which appears under the rubric of national affairs was written by Mr. Tilden. The forecast and wisdom of this statement, and its direct bearing upon what had occurred and upon what was to occur, time had only made more conspicuous. In the course of this statement he says, Tilden's views of the constitutional mode of counting electoral votes national affairs. The recent presidential election threatens to prove an epoch of solemn portent in our history. For the first time in the 22 elections which have been held for President and Vice President of the United States, the result remains a subject of controversy after the canvass of the votes within the states had been made and announced. The two houses of Congress have been heretofore repeatedly required to pass upon the authenticity and validity of electoral votes, but in no former instance had the election turned upon the questionable votes. In every former case the result has been determined by electoral votes which were not in controversy. In the present instance one candidate for president and one candidate for vice president have received 184 undisputed electoral votes, as well as a popular majority exceeding 250,000. Another candidate for president and another for vice president have received 165 undisputed electoral votes. All the votes of 3 states, 4 in Florida, 8 in Louisiana, and 7 in South Carolina, making 19 in all, are still in dispute, also one of the 3 in Oregon. In all these cases 2 sets of returns have been transmitted to the seat of government, directed to the President of the Senate, to await the action of the 2 houses of Congress, whose duty it is to verify, ascertain, and count the electoral votes. In a situation involving such momentous results as the chief magistracy of this republic, all the baser as well as the better forces of society are naturally embattled to secure the prize. It is in such crises of history that the controlling force of cardinal principles is liable to be weakened, dangerous concessions to be made, perilous precedents established, sacred traditions violated, and the most important bulwarks of constitutional freedom rendered less secure. In Louisiana we have seen a state government imposed on the people by the military force of the federal executive under color of a pretended order of a federal judge, which order in itself was void, and which led to the resignation of the judge who made it, to escape impeachment. We have seen the government thus imposed by military force condemned as illegal and a mere usurpation, by both houses of Congress, and the electoral votes given under its auspices rejected in the counting of the presidential votes in 1873 by the concurrent judgment of the same tribunal. We have seen the government so imposed create a returning board practically vested with absolute power to revise and, if they please, to reverse the results of the election by the people of the state, and thus organize a political mechanism under which an oligarchy in temporary possession of the legislative power of a state might perpetuate their ascendancy indefinitely. I pause here in this statement to interpose, in behalf of the people of this great Commonwealth, a solemn denial of the power of any state government or of the federal government to vest such powers as are claimed by the Louisiana Returning Board in any canvassing board whatever. In the first place, such powers in respect to the choice of presidential electors are not warranted by, but are repugnant to, the Constitution of the United States. The provision of Section 1 of Article 2 of that instrument, that each state shall appoint, in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct, its presidential electors, does not confer of the legislation of a state an unlimited power over the subject. No one will pretend that a temporary majority in the legislature of the state could grant to an individual, or, to a set of individuals, the power to appoint presidential electors, that it could make this grant for a period of years, or indefinitely, or to his or their heirs or assigns. What it cannot do in form it cannot do in substance, what it cannot do directly it cannot do indirectly. The choice which a legislature is authorized to make for a state, in the mode of appointing presidential electors, is limited to a mere selection between certain known forms of action, recognized in the practice of popular government, and consistent with the nature of popular government. It is a choice of modes, but must not change or destroy the essential character of the thing itself. It is subject to the condition that the state shall appoint the presidential electors. The state, that is, the political community knows in our jurisprudence and constitutional law by that name must appoint, and in doing so it must act by and through its known and rightful organs. At the time this provision of the federal constitution was adopted, it was contemplated that the legislature of a state possessing all the governmental powers not withdrawn by the provisions of the state constitution, or transferred to the government of the Union, might itself choose the electors. And, indeed, that was the mode at first generally practiced by the states. The state legislature at that time was regarded as the most natural and the legitimate organ of the state. The power to choose presidential electors might properly be conferred upon the people of the state by a general ticket, the voters throughout the state choosing all the electors, or they might be chosen by the people of the state voting in districts, each district choosing one elector. These were methods consonant with the principles of our system of government, and by either of which it could be properly said that the state did, in fact, appoint the electors. It is historically certain that these different modes were in the contemplation of the convention which formed the Constitution. Experiencing some difficulty, however, in imposing this duty upon all the states by any one uniform system, it devolved upon the legislatures of each state the authority to choose from among these methods, one for the exercise of that power which it granted in declaring that each state shall appoint. While the legislature of a state may provide that presidential electors shall be appointed by an election of the people, it cannot provide that that election shall not be a reality, that it shall be a sham, and that the actual power of determining the choice shall be invested in a packed committee, whether it be called a returning board, or by any other name. Neither can it invest a board of canvassers with indefinite or with arbitrary powers, nor with any authority which, by the principles and practice of our jurisprudence and the policy of our elective system, is not fairly incident to the function of ascertaining the votes of the people. This seems to me the obvious, the wide interpretation of the Constitution of the United States and of its laws. Any other doctrine will open the way to abuses, frauds, and usurpations, which must end in destroying popular elections. The moment we depart from a strict construction of grants of power in derogation of the integrity and efficiency of the elective system, we shall be able to find no rule that will protect the rights of the people. We shall tempt transient majorities to seek to prolong their power by tampering with the machinery of elections, and the easiest, most convenient, and most effectual method for such a purpose is by the contrivance of returning boards, which shall be packed and equipped with powers hitherto unknown to our laws and practically subversive of the will of the people. In the particular case of Louisiana, other equally grave illegalities are believed to exist. The powers vested in the returning board are inconsistent with the provision in the Constitution of that state, which guarantees the elective franchise to voters, and also with the provision which confers the judicial power upon the courts. It is probable that the powers of this board, by the law of Louisiana, do not apply to presidential electors, that the board itself was not constituted in accordance with the law under which it was created, and finally, that a condition, without which the returning board could not get jurisdiction in cases where it assumed to reject votes of whole districts, was not complied with. There is every reason to believe that the authority exercised by that returning board could not get jurisdiction in the cases where it assumed to reject the votes of whole districts, was not complied with. There is every reason to believe that the authority exercised by that returning board is void, as repugnant to the Constitution of the United States, and also to the Constitution and laws of Louisiana. In this state of the law, that returning board, according to public statements of conceded facts, by manipulations of the returns, have changed a majority for one set of presidential electors of about 9,000 to a majority for another set of about 4,000, which would be equivalent to a change of over 80,000 votes in the state of New York. In Florida we have seen a board of state canvassers, solemnly adjudged by the highest court in the state to possess none but ministerial powers, assume the authority to reverse the choice of electors as shown on the face of the returns made by the officers who conducted the elections and received the votes, and to do this in open disobedience and contempt of the judicial tribunal having jurisdiction in such matters, and vested with the right of final judgment. In South Carolina we have seen the Board of State Canvassers fabricating a canvass in like disobedience and contempt of the Supreme Court having jurisdiction and the right of final judgment. We have seen federal soldiery take possession of the capital of the state, and a corporal at the door determining who were the elect of the people, and who were to be permitted to represent them as legislators. Notwithstanding some of these acts have been disavowed by the federal executive, no mark of disapprobation has been put upon the authors of the outrages. The officer in command goes still unrebuked, and when the returning board were committed to prison for contempt by the highest court of the state, a judge of the United States District Court is sent down to South Carolina, and, without jurisdiction in the case, grants a writ of habeas corpus, and discharges the offenders. These proceedings are the more extraordinary and alarming when we consider that such violations of law and of right have been resorted to overturn elections, all of the officers conducting which were of the same political party with the candidates in whose favor these acts have been committed, that the elections were held under the surveillance of troops of the United States without any constitutional warrant for their presence, and that the judicial decisions thus set at naught cannot be suspected of any partisan bias, for they were rendered both in Florida and South Carolina by judges, all of whom were of the same political party with the returning board. These interferences of the military power have been committed in flagrant violation of the Constitution and laws. They were not provoked by domestic violence, they were not invited in the only way that would have made them constitutional, by the legislature of the state, and they were continued after the election was over and during all the subsequent proceeding of the canvassing board. Note: habeas corpus, one of a variety of writs that may be issued to bring a party before a court or judge, having as its function the release of the party from unlawful restraint. Reference U.S. Senate website. Note: 1913, the Constitution was amended, 17th Amendment, to provide for direct popular election of senators, ending the system of election by individual state legislatures. Connecticut's approval gave the 17th Amendment the required 3/4 majority, and it was added to the Constitution in 1913. The following year marked the first time all senatorial elections were held by popular vote. The 17th Amendment restates the first paragraph of Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution and provides for the election of senators by replacing the phrase, "chosen by the legislature thereof," with, "elected by the people thereof." In addition, it allows the governor or executive authority of each state, if authorized by that state's legislature, to appoint a senator in the event of a vacancy, until a general election occurs. The 17th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, elected by the people thereof, for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. The electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislatures. When vacancies happen in the representation of any state in the Senate, the executive authority of such state shall issue writs of election to fill such vacancies, provided that the legislature of any state may empower the executive thereof to make temporary appointments until the people fill the vacancies by election as the legislature may direct. This amendment shall not be so construed as to affect the election or term of any senator chosen before it becomes valid as part of the Constitution. The Constitution of the United States confers upon the President of the Senate no power whatever in respect to the counting of the electoral votes, except, in presence of the Senate and House of Representatives, to open all the certificates which may be transmitted by the college to the seat of government, directed to him. The President of the Senate has ever claimed or exercised such a power at any of the 21 presidential elections that have occurred under our Constitution. The mode of procedure for the counting of electoral votes has been invariably regulated by the 2 houses of Congress, by concurrent resolution or standing rules adopted before the count. Those resolutions or rules have prescribed every step in the whole process, every function of the tellers and of the President of the Senate, whenever any additional service, even of the most formal sort, has been required of him. In every instance the counting has been conducted in conformity with the procedure thus prescribed by the two houses, by servants designated by the two houses under instructions and in the presence of the two houses, and with the entire concurrence and the implicit of obedience of every president of the Senate who has participated in these ceremonies. So often as any question arisen as to the authenticity or validity of an electoral vote, the two houses have assumed and exercised the exclusive power to act upon and determine that question. They have, in contemplation of law, themselves made every count. They have from the first assumed exclusive jurisdiction to regulate and govern the whole transaction by temporary concurrent orders adopted for the occasion, by standing joint rules, and by the enactment of laws. Such has been the uniform and uninterrupted course of precedence, the invariable practice of the government, and the official exposition of the Constitution, which has been deliberately adopted, invariable acted upon, and universally accepted. No filter repository of all such powers as are vested in or must of necessity be exercised by the government can be found than the two houses of Congress. They are not only the general agents of the people under our representative system, but in case of the failure of a choice of president and vice president by the electoral colleges, they are expressly charged by the Constitution with the duty of making the election. The people of the United States will never consent to have their representatives in Congress stripped of these powers, or tolerate this usurpation by a deputy of the Senate, or by any single person, and still less by an officer who is frequently interested as a candidate in the result of the count. In this sentiment and purpose the state of New York cordially concurs. Foremost among all our American commonwealths in population, in the variety and extent of her industries and interests, she has in every vicissitude of public affairs put forth all her strength, moral and physical, to maintain the existence and the just authorities of the Union, and she can never consent that the time-consecrated methods of the constitutional government shall be supplanted or overthrown by revolutionary expedients. Additional note: the late James G. Blaine, serving as one of the visitors at the West Point Military Academy, a year or two after the inauguration of Hayes, expressed himself to me as greatly surprised when the Democrats in Congress assented to the plan of the Electoral Commission. He added that if the Democrats had been firm the Republicans had no alternative but to yield, and such was the result which he had anticipated. Why Mr. Tilden's advice, so simple, so wise, so logical, so sure sooner or later to enlist the sympathies and respect of every law-abiding citizen in the land, was not followed, is a question which I do not feel called to enter upon here. Besides, it involves the discussion of motives which can never be subjected to any undebatable test, and if they could be, the profit of such a discussion now is more than questionable. I shall discharge my duty as his biographer in reporting what Mr. Tilden did to save his party, without dwelling more than is necessary for that purpose upon what others did to wreck it. The Electoral Commission scheme was not disclosed to Mr. Tilden until it was too late for any opposition on his part to be effective in prosecuting his method, which was only constitutional method of settling the questions in dispute. How it was first brought to his attention was thus set down in a carefully considered communication addressed by Mr. Manton Marble of the New York Sun, on the 5th of August 1878. The tenor of this communication, as well as the circumstances under which it appeared, leave little doubt that before it was given to the public it passed under Mr. Tilden's eyes. On the evening of Saturday, January 13th, the undersigned, calling upon Mr. Tilden, found him in receipt of the McCrary House bill with proposed amendments, and a letter from Mr. Hewitt advertising the governor that his counsel thereon would be asked the next day. Mr. Tilden invited the undersigned to call on the morrow, when Mr. Hewitt should be there, to consider this bill, the supposed axis on which the deliberations of the House Conference Committee were revolving. The undersigned thus came to be present January 14th, the day and date when Mr. Tilden received from Mr. Hewitt's lips his first information that other measures had been abandoned, that the Senate Conference Committee had just disclosed to the House Conference Committee an Electoral Commission bill it had privately preparing, that the House Committee were pressed to accept and adopt the same, and that the subject he wished to confer upon was that. Mr. Hewitt explained as the Senate Committee's reason for secrecy, that without it they could not carry the bill. It had been adopted by arrangement between the 3 Democratic and the 4 Republican members, and was so strictly observed that when Senator Kernan made inquiry of one of the former, he was told that nothing could be disclosed to him without violating an honorable understanding. So well was the secret kept, that Senator Barnum, now chairman of the National Committee, passing through New York on Friday, the 12th, has expressed his conviction that a majority of the Senate, as Mr. Tilden's plan anticipated, would concur in denying the right of Ferry to make the count. Before he read the new bill, Mr. Tilden was told by Mr. Hewitt that the Democratic members of the Senate committee were already absolutely committed to it, and would concur with their Republican associates in reporting it to the Senate, whether the House committee should concur or not, and whether Mr. Tilden approved of it or not. "Is it not rather late, then," said Mr. Tilden, "to consult with me?" "They do not consult you," replied Mr. Hewitt. "They are public men, and have their own duties and responsibilities. I consult you." In other words, as Mr. Tilden expressed himself to me at the time, the parents of this measure have sent Mr. Hewitt, not to consult with me about it, but to get my approval of it. This Mr. Tilden declined to give, and urged delay. When its friends pretended that time pressed, he told them, "There is time enough. It is a month before the count. It had best be used, all of it, in making the people and their agents fully acquainted with their rights and duties." To the statement that the Senate committee would not delay for this to present their bill, with the unanimous approval of its 3 Democratic members, to the Republican Senate, Mr. Tilden replied, "It is a panic of pacificators. They will act in haste and repent at leisure." To representations of the danger of a collision of force with the executive, Mr. Tilden replied, "Nevertheless, this action is too precipitate. The fears of collision are exaggerated. And why surrender now? You can always surrender. That is all you have to do after being beaten. Why surrender before the battle for fear of having to surrender after the battle is over?" Footnote: This recalls the advice which Dr. Franklin gave to his son when colonial governor of New Jersey: "Perhaps they may expect that your resentment of their treatment of me may induce you to resign and save them the shame of depriving you, when they ought to promote you. But this I would not advise you to do. Let them take your place if they want it, though in truth it is scarce worth your keeping, since it has not afforded you sufficient to prevent your running every year behindhand with me. One may make something of an injury, nothing of a resignation." Bigelow's Life of Franklin, under date of February 29, 1874. End footnote. Unfortunately, the course of procedure which Mr. Tilden had traced out and urged upon the party was no longer possible. Their line of battle had been broken. The 2 controlling Democratic senators on the committee, by their negotiations had practically surrendered the Democratic fortress. The plain, square issue made by Mr. Tilden could not be revived after a willingness to negotiate and make concessions had once been manifested. Even had it been still possible to defeat the proposed scheme of arbitration, that would not have restored the fortress, it would not have made it any longer practicable to resume Mr. Tilden's plan of battle. To that, as Mr. Marble justly remarks, the conditions of success were an indomitable and untied democracy and an unbroken favoring public opinion. But the mere proposal of the electoral arbitrament, backed by great Democratic leaders, caused 3 illusions to prevail: the illusion that such an arbitrament was the only alternative to civil war, the illusion that such a tribunal must establish the truth in its decision and the people in their rights, the illusion of the business classes, oppressed by long suffering under ruinous tariffs and fluctuating currencies, that was the harbinger of new prosperity. So that the Rand and File would have been resuming a contest abandoned by their familiar leasers as hopeless, and attempting recurrence to the earlier issue amidst a public opinion now reversed and hostile. Instead, therefore, of wasting his energies in useless criticism of what had been done, Mr. Tilden directed his attention to such modifications in the structure of this projected court of arbitration as he thought essential. If an arbitration is to be adopted, he insisted that the members of the tribunal ought to be fixed in the bill itself, not left to chance or intrigue. That the duty of the arbitrators to investigate and decide the case on its merits should be made mandatory, not left to their decision. With both these vital points left at loose ends, he said, you cannot succeed. You cannot afford to concede, and you can exact, first, the selection of good men to compose the tribunal, which is the controlling point, and, second, define the nature of the function to be performed by the tribunal, which is next in importance. Fix these 2 points, good men, explicit powers, and you might possible get through. Leave them doubtful, and it is happy-go-luck, the shake of the dicebox. When pressed by suggestions of the improbability of the House insisting upon its independent constitutional rights without the support of the Democratic senators who were committed to a compromise, he said, if you go into a conference with your adversary, and can't break off, because you feel you must agree to something, you cannot negotiate at all. Unless you are able to break off, you are not fit to negotiate. You will be beaten on every detail. On the 15th of January Mr. Hewitt telegraphed from Washington to his brother-in-law, Edward Cooper, in New York, the Senate committee will probably reject 5 and report 6-judge plan immediately. Our senators feel committed to concur. House committee will not concur, and for present will probably not report. To this suggestion Mr. Tilden said, I may lost the presidency, but I will not raffle for it. To Mr. Hewitt he telegraphed through Mr. Cooper, procrastinate to give few days for information and consultation. The 6-judge proposition inadmissible. The next day Mr. Hewitt telegraphed again to Mr. Cooper, Washington, January 16, 1877, after protracted negotiation Senate, committee, receded from 6-judge, scheme, declined 5-judge, and offered 4 senior associates justices, who are to choose the 5th judge, excluding Chief Justice. Our Senate friends earnestly favor acceptance, because they do not believe it possible to pass over. The Democrats on House committee believe this is the last chance of agreement. We cannot postpone beyond 11 tomorrow, and if we decline, Senate committee will report their original plan, to which our friends are committed. Telegraph your advice. Mr. Tilden sent the following answer, New York, January 16. Be firm and be cool. For judge plan will not do. Perhaps worse than 6. Complaints likely to arise of haste and want of consultation with members, and embarrassment in exercise of their judgment after plan is disclosed, by premature committal of their representatives. There should be more opportunity for deliberation and consultation. Secrecy dangerous. Probably mistake in itself, and if it results in disaster would involve great blame and infinite mischief. The night of the day that the foregoing telegram was sent, the foregoing telegrams were canvassed by Mr. Tilden in the presence of several of his friends, at the conclusion of which he dictated the following telegram, no need of hot haste, but much danger in it. Some days' interval should be taken. The risk of publicity is harmless. No information here, nor any opportunity to get information which could justify abstinence from condemning such an abandonment of the Constitution and practice of the government, and of the rights of the 2 houses and of the people. Nothing but great and certain public danger, not to be escaped in any other way, could excuse such a measure. We are overpressed by exaggerated fears, and forget that the other side will have greater troubles than we, unless relieved by some agreement. They have no way out but by usurpation. They are bullying us with what they dare not do, or will break down in attempting. So long as we stand on the Constitution and settle practice, we know where we are. Consequence of new expedient not enough considered. Only way of getting accessions in the Senate is by House standing firm. And judicious friends believe in that case we will go safely through. Opportunity to consult such friends should be given, before even tacit acquiescence, by House committee, if that is contemplated, though details may be properly discussed, final committal by House committee should be firmly withheld. Before this telegram had reached, or at least been seen by, Mr. Hewitt, the surrender had been consummated. In no single particular from the beginning to the consummation of the transaction had the advice of Mr. Tilden been acted upon. He advised the House of Representatives, with a majority in sympathy with the majority of the people, to stand upon its constitutional rights, and leave to the Senate, if it dared, the responsibility of violating those rights. Instead of exercising the rights and discharging the duties imposed upon it in the most unequivocal terms, it accepted a scheme for counting votes which originated with a body having no corresponding contingent authority, and in political sympathy with the majority of a commission recruited from and controlled by a bench every member of which had been appointed by Republican presidents. Mr. Tilden had urged publicity and discussion, insisting that secrecy in respect to any plan involving the rights and interests of the whole people was unwise, dangerous, and essentially undemocratic. The scheme adopted was conceived and begotten in a corner, and never exposed to the light of day until it had wrought irremediable mischief. Still less was it submitted to such a discussion as befitted a measure involving the chief magistracy of 50 millions of people. Mr. Tilden advised against the betrayal of any symptoms of a possibility of concession. "You can surrender at any time," he said. "It will be time enough to surrender when you are beaten." They began their deliberations by concession, and surrendered without an engagement, fully a month before the time for discussion and for the arrival of reinforcements of public opinion for their constituencies could have expired. They made indecent haste to precipitate themselves at the feet of their adversaries, as though they supposed their humiliation would be imputed to them for righteousness. Mr. Tilden advised them to trust the people, to stand by them and the Constitution, and no one American statesman had ever a better right, from experience, to speak dogmatically on the subject. Instead of trusting the people, they conducted all their negotiations in secret, and suppressed discussion until everything was surrendered worth saving, or that discussion might have saved. When it was decided to submit the issue to arbitration, Mr. Tilden insisted that the law creating the arbitrators should require them to decide the issue on its merits, and not leave to them the determination of what were to be their duties. Firmness upon this point, to which the Republicans of the Senate, sooner or later, must have yielded, would most certainly have resulted in confirming the election of the candidate of the people's choice. This wise advice was rejected, and rejected, too, for clowns' swords and Quaker guns. As the Honorable Henry Watterson most fitly said, Mr. Tilden was the one man who took in the whole case and provided a plan to compass it. That plan was for the House of Representatives to exercise its constitutional rights to share in the count of the vote, no state to be counted except by the concurrence of both houses, precisely as had been done in all preceding elections, each state lacking the concurrence of the two houses to be thrown out, in the event of a failure of either candidate by this process of throwing out to secure a majority of all the votes, the House to elect the President and the Senate to elect the Vice President. That was Mr. Tilden's plan, pure and simple. It sprang directly from the Constitution, the law and the practice. To overreach it, the conspirators much proceed openly to treason and usurpation. In that event, the House still had its right to elect, and, if it elects me, said Mr. Tilden at the time, I will go to Washington and take the oath if I am shot for it the next day. Mr. Tilden's plan embraced no shilly-shollying or foolishness. It meant business. He had to move either by force or by law. Force was out of the question. The country was not prepared for war, and the party would not follow him into war. All that a show of fight on his part could do would be to inflame a few excited spirits and play into the hands of the conspirators, who had the tools, and only wanted the pretext to come down upon the unorganized and helpless Democrats. Wisely he declined either to raffle or bluff for the presidency. He proposed to proceed by law, the law of every preceding electoral count, and to force the Republicans, if bent upon their work of usurpation, to resort to violence and treason. He believed they would break down before they got through it. Believing in the people, his idea was that the people needed only to be educated in their rights to maintain them. He presented a line of action. He prepared a magazine of instruction. These were set aside, and, in lieu of them, a bridge was constructed over which the conspirators could, and did, walk in safety. End chapter 3, Part 1.